All right, how you guys doing? Really? All right. So I can't really see very well, but I am interested to know how many of you were in Portland during the 1960s? Well done. Yeah, right, with pride, everyone, with pride. We do so much at the Oregon Historical Society, and I don't want to take all our time tonight to tell you about it. I want you to know that we're located downtown on the park blocks, right across from the Art Museum, and that if you live in Multnomah County, you can come to the museum and the research library at no charge, because Multnomah County supports us with a property tax levy, and we are grateful for that. So come on down, check out our research collections. We have 3 full floors of exhibits and some really fantastic things there right now. But I want to tell you about 2 things that OHS is doing that are related to the 1960s. So I am interested to know how many of you remember the Center for the Moving Image at Portland State University? Tom Taylor, Andreas Dienham? Yes, but some clapping, right? So we publish a journal every 3 months at OHS, and the next issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly has a full article about Andreas Dienham and the Center for the Moving Image, and the prize goes to anyone who can tell me exactly how to pronounce his name. So, Dienham? Right, okay. So that's coming out, and then also, many of you probably remember the 1963 March on Washington, and know that there was a march happening here in Portland and also in Washington, D.C. this weekend. The actual anniversary of that march is this Wednesday, August 28th. And we're doing 2 things at OHS, and you're invited. These are free and open to the public. At noon, which is about 3 o'clock Eastern time, which is about the time that Dr. King gave his speech, we're going to play the speech in our pavilion, in our front lobby, and you're welcome to come and listen to the speech with us and hear a little bit of reflection on that afterward. A great way to spend your lunch hour or your day if you don't have to go to work. And then at 7 o'clock in the evening on Wednesday, we're going to have a teach-in about the Voting Rights Act. And probably, yes, there's some major changes with the Voting Rights Act from the Supreme Court decision that came down in June. And of course, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and the 1963 March on Washington was a big part of that. And a lot of you who raised your hands of being in Portland in the 1960s probably remember all of that and may have been quite shocked by the Supreme Court decision. So we have scholars and participants on hand to tell us what happened, what it means, and all of that good stuff. Real teach-in. For a youngster like me, it's exciting. So please join us for those. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Hills, who's going to introduce tonight's panel.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome. This is going to be a great night. Thanks to all of you. Look how many people turned out. This is fantastic. We do have a very special evening of history and music radiating from the theme of Portland in the 60s tonight. And as Eliza just mentioned, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington is upon us, 2 days away, and that, of course, is a shining example of how people in the 60s changed the system, changed history. There was also critical mass movements that brought positive advances to free speech and, of course, anti-war. And a key factor that helped crystallize and motivate these movements, the thousands and thousands of people that were involved, was music, a soundtrack for the era of change. It was heard around the world, and certainly in the streets, coffee houses, parks, and dance halls in Oregon. So tonight, to tell the Portland story, we have a remarkable panel. First, Paulina Olson. She is the moderator of the panel and, of course, the author of Portland in the 60s, Stories from the Counterculture. Next to her is Hank Pender, an influential artist and early storefront theater, set and costume designer, as well as many other things. Is Walter Cole, owner of the Cafe Espresso, which pioneered the Portland coffee house scene, and soon-to-be legendary performer Garcelle. Garcelle is Michael Wells, editor of the Portland Underground newspapers, the Willamette Bridge, and the Portland Scribe. And then on the very end is Peter Langston, vocalist and lead guitarist of the Portland Zoo. So these folks are going to have a dialogue for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes of Q&A after that. Now, I just want to let everyone know, to facilitate the Q&A, we're going to ask you to write down questions on a piece of paper and submit them out at the table in the lobby, or I will be up here and we'll collect them. It just will make things go faster as opposed to having people stand up and ask questions. This way we can have them brief and succinctly and in our hands. So please, if you have questions, feel free to go out to the lobby and fill out a piece of paper. There's pens and papers there. Or if you have pen and paper with you in your seats, you can write something out and you can hand them to me at the stage. Let's see. And then finally, after the question and answer, we have two incredible bands performing for us tonight. And who are they? Portland Zoo and the Tweedy Brothers. All right, so no more ado, here's Paulina Olson.
Thank you for coming. I'm Paulina. The first question goes to Darcel, and I'd like to ask you, Darcel, what events led up to owning and managing the Cafe Espresso, which was the first Italian coffee house in Portland?
What led up to it?
Yeah.
I was working for Fred Meyer. That's all I have to say right now. And I'd been in the military. I came home from the military. In 52, I was back in Portland. And I went back to Fred Meyer, worked for a few years, and decided that when my checkers were making more money than management, and I was working 7 days a week occasionally, that I'd be on my own, and like the sign said, I looked in the paper and it's under business opportunities, a coffee house for sale. I had no idea. Southeast Portland, crew cut, horn rim glasses. I ended up with beatniks. Perfect. I had the first espresso machine north of San Francisco. Totally illegal now. It was a boiler with the open gas flame at the bottom and a pressure gauge that you had to watch quite carefully, which I learned how to do very quickly. I had music. In fact, I was just talking to some musicians that sat in on music. We started music with folk music. My jug band, we had Earl Benson and his jug band. Anybody here remember Earl Benson? He had that zither going all the time on his lap, just playing the crazy. He was great. Molly Malarkey, if she sang one more time Puff the Magic Dragon, I was going to commit whatever it was. I've never heard so much Joan Baez music in my entire life. So when it came time to have jazz, the doors opened, and some of the local jazz players, John Bunce played guitar like nobody in the world ever. Classical guitar was beautiful. And Tom Grant played piano at our place when he was in high school. He's now world famous. He might be here. Are you here? He is? Good. His wife hired me to entertain at his birthday party one time. Yes. It was different. No, it was fun. We had a great time. So then the coffee house evolved from folk music into jazz, and then Urban Renewal comes along and gives me $5,000 if I moved. So I moved to 3rd and Clay. I was at 6th and Harrison when I first opened, and I moved to 3rd and Clay, right behind the stage door of what was then the Civic Theater. It was a very successful move, and then we started getting garage bands in, kids coming in with their that worked in the garage and came at a venue, and we also had professional musicians in all the time, and so coffee was 50 cents a cup with no refills. So I didn't have much money to pay the musicians, so I paid them what I could. The union knocked on my door and said, this has got to stop. So I went down to the union and I talked to them about it, and I said, this is what I can pay, and any time they get a gig and they go out on the road or go to they're more than welcome. They're not signed to any contracts to stay, and they could make their money, and they left us alone for the whole time. It was great. It worked pretty good. I opened an after-hours jazz place. It wasn't bad enough to work for Fred Meyer in the morning, opened the coffee house at 7 o'clock to 1 o'clock, and then on weekends, from 1 o'clock to 4 in the morning, I opened an after-hours jazz place, which was absolutely successful. People like Cal Jader and all of the local jazz musicians who came to, there's something, it's a Starlight Room, I think it's still going. The Candle Room, anyway. They played at our place until wee hours in the morning. It was wonderful. I cooked breakfast for them.
What'd you cook? What'd you make for breakfast?
Oh, eggs, things, you know. I don't know. Ham and eggs, hash browns, coffee.
My next question goes to Peter Langston. If you guys if you want to comment on anything Darcel says, just jump in and say. Or otherwise, Peter, I wanted to ask you. You once told me the zoo was a test bed where you could try any idea. Could you explain what you meant by that and give some examples?
Well, yeah, we didn't feel too much constrained by propriety or what other people had done or what other people thought we should do. And so we mixed a lot of things together. We mixed a lot of musical genres from Arab music to folk music to old blues to gospel to German nightclub music, just all stuff that we had heard and liked, and we would be in the middle of an old blues tune and we'd think, that sounds kind of like this little Kurt Weill thing. Maybe we should just quote a little bit of that in here. And we also mixed media. We mixed both sort of forms from just straight, band playing music to dance to performances like making a small opera about what was going on in the Portland drug scene, something we saw a lot of. And we would mix musical instruments. We would make instruments out of electronic toys that it turned out a little organ where you would make it as a kit, and it has push buttons that switch a different resistor in for each different note. But if you didn't put it in its case and you just kind of pushed your finger between two buttons, you could be the resistor yourself. And so you ended up making something like a theremin that would make squealing pig noises, which were always handy in rock and roll. And then we found that if we held the guitar over the keyboard had like 100 and some little frequency generators, and the guitar pickup would pick those up kind of like anything you were near, and so it'd be kind of like this harp that was being played by the wind as you passed it up and down over and go, so we thought, well, that belongs in rock and roll. And then we found that we could make tape recorders feedback. And so we thought, well, we definitely need something that goes, I mean, you gotta have that, don't you? So we kind of gave ourselves permission to use whatever felt good at the moment. And as a result, I think we were considered strange, but people really liked strange, so we were in.
Peter, you mentioned the opera. Could you talk a little bit more about Violet Shrink and the opera that you
It was the days of Mayor Terry Shrunk.
Yes.
And so our opera is called Ahead of His Times, and meant to be taken both ways. It was about our mainline hero, Dexter Speed, who played in a local rock and roll band, and one of his fans was the mayor's daughter, Violet Shrink. And Violet really had the hots for Dexter, but Dexter really had no use for her until Agent McNasty chased him down on one of those wonderful moments of running around the stage playing and trying not to trip over the guitar chords as Dwarf chased me around the stage as Agent McNasty and finally caught me and threw me in jail as Dexter, at which point I realized that Violet could be really handy. And so I wrote her a love song. Dexter wrote her, no, it wasn't me. Dexter wrote her a love song. And actually, I can't remember if it worked. I can't remember if he got out of jail. Did he get out of jail? Does anybody remember? I don't think so. I don't think it worked. But we were moralists after all.
My next question is for Hank. Hank, what was the Storefront Theater and what was your involvement?
Well, there's kind of a little story before the Storefront, and I'll have to sort of explain a little bit about how I ended up here in the 60s, the mid-60s from Amsterdam, and at the same time what happened to me personally and how I ultimately ended up being intensely involved in the Storefront Theater. I was born in Haarlem in Holland, and I went to the State Academy of Fine Art in Amsterdam. I graduated there in '61. In the early 60s, so my whole life, sort of the whole period of the 60s, was one of incredible turmoil and learning and extremely formative in my life. In the early 60s, I met a woman from Portland, and we became involved and got married in Amsterdam. And in 1965, I moved to Portland, where she was from, and became a young art teacher at the then Museum Art School. The difference between Amsterdam and Portland was just extreme. I grew up in this art world, surrounded by artists and museums and, art. And I came in this, relatively small town in an art world which was utterly alien to me and sort of foreign, and the kind of art was being made here I had very little connection with. And the United States was involved in the Vietnamese War. I was hardly any older, actually, than my students at the art school, and I happened to be in a class that half the class was stoned in LSD and painted paintings in paisley and incredible colors and all that, and I'm trying to, from my European classic background, trying to sort of develop some kind of understanding about what are you guys seeing? So I thought, well, I'll just have to try this stuff out. So I did. And it's caused me later on this tremendous problems because I casually said to my colleagues, the faculty, oh, by the way, I tried that out, so now I know what they're seeing. And they thought, oh my God, that's really illegal and bad and all that. So I became friends with the students. And the students were more my age and stuff, and they were extremely engaged in the time itself, which also involved like big rock dances at the Crystal Ballroom, for instance. I remember going dancing there. And there was just an incredible amount of creativity, although it was utterly different from the kind of art I was used to. And basically that whole period of mine was just extreme culture shock. I also knew very little about the United States and about its culture and its background. I had never been in Amsterdam. I'd never even heard of Portland. I didn't know where it was. I knew Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. So it was just an incredibly intense and somewhat unsettling period. In '68, we moved back to Amsterdam after having been here for 2 years, and by that time my life had become in so much turmoil that our marriage was sort of become unstable, and we moved back to Portland and separated there. And I have my 2 sons, young sons, Jacob and Arnold, who are actually here tonight. In 1969, so I got a big studio on the corner of First and Bernstein, a big loft, which Mike Monshalen had sort of given me. There's a huge space, and I started making paintings which were expressionist paintings, and they sort of reflected on the incredible turmoil I had gone through in this last period, and also sort of reflected on the war and all the kind of tensions that involved. A lot of my students also, some of them were inducted into the army. There was just enormous, there were demonstrations, there was kind of a demand for doing political posters. And since the art world out here, the artists were all making color-filled paintings and extremely abstract, non-figurative art, I felt as an artist, having sort of remembering the Second World War, started making kind of anti-war posters. There were, I thought, similarities between what I vaguely remember. It was only 20 years ago, in 1965, that the Second World War had finished in Holland, and I grew up as a small child in occupied Netherlands, and I saw, like, you know, maybe naively so and inappropriately so, but I saw similarities between the, you know, massive bombing raids in Vietnam, where whole villages were obliterated, there were massacres, there were riots, there were like incredible tension between the police and the burgeoning counterculture, of which I had sort of shifted into because the students of mine were sort of my age. They had sort of embraced me in a sense, and so it gave me kind of a sense of home and a sense of place. In 1969, I had sort of in this big studio, I made a whole bunch of new paintings just sort of for the hell of it and reflecting on all this turmoil. And also, there was the period also, you may remember, the sexual revolution. I was, you know, relatively young myself, and I was removed away from Calvinist Netherlands, and so it gave me a lot of sort of personal freedom to also kind of explore that sort of somewhat depressed part of my own personal life. So all that got into these paintings. And then I was a show at Portland State in 1969 in the winters, so that was the end of the decade in a sense. And the exhibition, to my total terror and surprise, caused incredible furor. And the police would come. There would be just letters to the editor, which was just scandalized. Well, there was like sexuality. There were like figures which had erect penises. There was a kind of sense of devastation and war. The paintings were sort of bleak. They had a kind of dark sort of humor, but it also had a kind of a sense of kind of despair about them. They had big spaces in them, and there were kind of references to really to the time. You know, there was also like imagery. You know, maybe it was, you know, in retrospect, I think it was sort of bad, but there was like the police was referred to as pigs, for instance, and so I had made these paintings of these huge pigs out there ejaculating in this landscape. To my surprise, actually, people got very upset. And I still hear about it occasionally. So,
right there. Hold that thought, and we're going to pick up on the round. We're going to pick up right there at that point, okay? But
I haven't gone to the store.
oh no, I know it, but you will. You will. But first, right now, I want to be sure to ask Michael, who is the editor and publisher of the alternative press here in Portland, the Willamette Bridge and then the Scribe. Michael, you said in the paper's first editorial you wrote, the Willamette Bridge will print news the mainstream press ignores, either by accident or by design. Can you tell me about topics that the bridge emphasized that were left out of the mainstream press?
Well,
Yes.
probably, in terms of big picture, there were 2 daily papers in Portland then. They both supported the Vietnam War. Probably the other thing was civil rights, that they maybe wrote about tentatively, but not with any, real sense of what the movement was. But Portland, I moved here in '66, and I had been living in New York and San Francisco, and I looked around and I thought, this is an overgrown lumber town. I'll be out here in a year. And, but the other thing that was in that first editorial was that there were pockets of people who weren't part of the sort of homogenous thing. There were Goose Hollow and over by Reed College and little pockets in Southeast and in Northwest, which at that point was still, low income, working class. And they might run into each other at the Aladdin Theater seeing a Fellini movie or something, but they were isolated. And so the Willamette Bridge was more sort of a community organizing place to try to connect people and to create a, as it were, alternative community among all of these sort of isolated groups. And the other thing that wasn't, I don't know that it's a topic per se for journalism, but what was going on in my world, those worlds, sort of wouldn't be considered news by the daily papers in terms of counterculture, living communes. Strangely enough, by '68, I was sort of out of the drug culture, being a little older than that. But drug culture and all that was going on. But the bridge was sort of, there was this community vehicle, and so as things happened, they were in the bridge first. So the women's rights movement, there, a couple of people who are probably here tonight,
Gay rights. I'm talking about gay rights, absolutely.
And there would be like there was a demonstration at the Miss Oregon pageant at Seaside or Gearhart or something, and that was
dress up as
Bridge.
witches? Did people dress up as witches?
Right, the witch, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, which was probably Denise's idea, I don't know. And then gay rights, and it was, I think there was a quote up here. There was a guy on the bridge staff who went, strangely enough, because he had short hair, sort of like mine right now, who everybody called Straight John. But it turned out he was gay. And he wrote an article, sort of coming out on, in the bridge. And that, people started calling him up. And that sort of became a, sort of a launch of the gay community coming together as a sort of maybe political way as opposed to social. Environmentalism, which none of these things were considered political, even by the left. The left in Portland, the official left, was still dealing with the working class and the unions and women and gays and trees. Those were too strange. And so it was not just big news that wasn't being covered, but there was this whole stuff, music. you know, weird art, coffee houses. There was all this stuff going on, and it sort of all gravitated to the newspaper.
Did anybody here work with you on the bridge?
Hank did some drawings.
Cheryl in our band did stories for the bridge. As a matter of fact, she wrote stories about us, I think. Made us famous.
Yeah. Which was one of the things, is that we weren't journalists per se. The people, you know, Cheryl would write about the band that she knew about. John Moscow, who was involved in the Black Panther Clinic, would come in and write about that. People, Kebu would write about Kebu. It was a sort of
It's a strange way to do things, having people write about something they know about.
it was sort of like a newsprint blog, you know. And then there was I didn't know Darcel or Walt at the Cafe Espresso. Somehow I missed that, but I knew him in between the things that he mentioned. He had a little ice cream store on about 12th and Montgomery.
What was it called? The ice cream store?
Trieste.
Cafe Trieste, excuse me. And that was down the hill from us. And I remember one time my then wife and I had flown back from visiting her parents in the Caribbean, and we had flown to New York and then Chicago. It was like 24 hours in airplanes and airports. And in those days there were student rates for flying. You could get cheap. And I was a little too old for student rates, so I had my friend David Nichols' ID in my pocket. And I had my ID in the other pocket. And I came in the morning and went to bed. There was a knock on the door, and I went to the door, and they said, FBI, we're looking for David Nichols. And I said, well, he's not here. They said, do you have any ID? I had to remember which pocket. And I got the right pocket, and then we went up to try and find David before the FBI did. And I went into the Trieste, and I said, Walt, have you seen David? And he said, yeah, he's going over to Terry's house. And the FBI was here looking for him, but I didn't tell them. So.
That's great. Darcel, could you tell me about the clientele at the Cafe Espresso and how it changed over the years?
Intellectuals. Let's see, I think they were called beatniks then. Read in the corner. Read a book in the corner of the room. All part of the atmosphere. I didn't want them to leave, because then if somebody came from Lake Oswego, they'd like to see what the hell's going on in this decadent place called Cafe Espresso. We had, at that point, that was at the beginning. Towards the end of the 60s, then we started, our jazz brought people in. We had one-man bands. We had people. We opened up to a lot more of the college trade, rather than the intellectual, the people that were considered beatniks, but they had more to say than the people who walked in later on. Then when we started getting jazz, and then after jazz we had rock and roll, bands, kids bands, and they came in, and so it just evolved. And finally, it was time to move on, and I put the ice cream parlor together, and then Urban Renewal took that also, and I bought Demas Tavern, where we are now after 46 years. It's that was in the 60s. We were a gay bar, but no gay men would cross Burnside because it was Skid Row then. and they were afraid to go down there, so I hired a lesbian bartender, and we had women loved coming down there. It worked out just fine, and they're still friends of mine. We started our shows, and the three of us, Roxy Leroy, who's still with me, by the way, after 46 years together. That's all right. And another entertainer, Tina Sandell. I never put a dress on, but I was in local theater and a couple of shows all over town. Firehouse Theater.
They wouldn't let you have music right away, though, would you? They wouldn't let you have music.
Oh no, they wouldn't. You could have music, but you couldn't be live music. You could have background music. You could, but so they didn't know what to do with us because we were miming like background music, so we weren't really live, and so the OLCC didn't know exactly what to do with us, and we had to close at 1 o'clock, and because we were a tavern, and 2:30 is when the liquor bars could close. So we were, and no dancing at all. No. Roxy did an adagio dance with a young man, and with throwing him over the head and his head, and do the whole Las Vegas routine, and they came in and they wrote a ticket for dancing. But by the time they processed the ticket, the law changed, you could have dancing. Good meeting, and we stayed open until 2:30 in the morning. So that all helped, yeah. And the rest is history. We're 208 Northwest Certification. Wednesday through Saturday night.
Peter, could you tell us about the Carricks? Did I pronounce that correctly? Is it Carricks or Sharks?
Carricks. Well, Carricks was was something that was sort of mutually beneficial for us and for, I think, the Unitarian Universalist Church. It was their outreach. They wanted to get in touch with troubled youth, and they figured out the way to get in touch with troubled youth was to have a coffee house. And so they started a coffee house in the basement of the church on Salmon, I think, 12th and Salmon. And they got in touch with troubled youth. Troubled youth got in touch with the dealers. And everybody had a great time. And
I was pissed.
We were there at just the right moment to become the house band, which was great for us. We could even keep our equipment there, which was great for us until somebody came and took it, which wasn't so great for us. But a lot of people took pity on us and lent us equipment and that kind of thing. But it was a great music scene. It was an opportunity for us to try out new things. We played every week, and it was an opportunity for the Gypsy Jokers to meet the Young Runaways. And
Excuse me, the who? The who?
the Gypsy Jokers,
Okay, they were the
local motorcycle gang.
Hells Angels type, sort of.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, a lot of runaways, got kind of found that way. A lot of runaways may have gotten distracted that way too. There was a nearby clinic, the Outside In Clinic, which, I think that was the last time I'd ever had a house call, was when Dr. Charles Spray from the Outside In Clinic came to our rehearsal because I had a migraine headache and an A&R man was coming from a record company, and so he thought it was important that I be okay.
No, he told me about that.
Did he? Oh, well, I'm glad he brags about it too. But it was a wonderful music scene for us. It was. I'm not sure how it worked out for the church because I think it cost them a bunch of money, and they were kind of embarrassed by the fact that it was really the place to buy drugs. But I think that's the right move. You want to have the action coming to you so that if you're going to be helpful, you can be there for it. But I think they were embarrassed by that. They didn't expect that.
Hank, we're right at the spot where you were accused of being somewhat pornographic with your show at the art show.
I have a comment on that. You know, Hank made some beautiful buttons for us. We wanted to make buttons that we give to the audience that expressed our feeling that they were a very important part of our band. So there were things that said member, Portland Zoo Electric Band. And then Hank drew some nice little animals on there. And we were delighted to see that these animals had genitalia. So we weren't embarrassed at all. We thought that was the way it ought to be. Remember that?
It was so much fun. It was also an incredibly, and a really extremely creative period. I mean, I think being young really had a lot to do with it, but also the times itself and the conflicts sort of within society set up kind of somewhat of a situation of them and us. And there was kind of the quote establishment and warfare in nature, and there was the police powers and all that. And then there was kind of the sort of young political sort of reaction on that. And there was also a whole sort of creative aspect. What happened was, to sort of continue just briefly the story I started out, after the exhibition in Portland and the extreme reaction to my work, and I had done Frida Rome and all that, I was just sort of startling. I thought, I'm going to go to a bigger city. I'm just going to go to San Francisco. Goodbye. And so somehow I managed to get an old school bus, an old 48-passenger Mack bus, painted it in bright colors, started the motor, and we drove to Bolinas, California, in Mesa, parked in Mesa, bought a funky old car, and I applied for a teaching position at the San Francisco Art Institute. However, I had been so remote from teaching by then, and so, rattled by the whole thing, that somehow the job did not materialize, and there I was living in a bus, and it was either I become a waiter at Scouties or Smiley's, or I go back to Portland. At least I had somewhat of a reputation there, marginal and controversial it may be. So, and I knew people here. So I came back to Portland and had no place to live anymore. And somehow I ended up with my friend Joe Gers in his house, and he said, "Hey Hank, tonight we're going to go to some theater people whom I'd never met, and they were making preparations to do a play titled Lysistrata at a farm titled Bar Farm. And it was going to be a kind of an anti-war play, which is set in old Greece, where the women refused their sexual privileges to their soldier men unless they quit fighting this war. And so they had apparently stolen or scored a whole bunch of columns from some old building, and so there were all these wooden columns, and I painted veins on them and stuff and made them enormous phalluses. And then we had a big piece of white viscody, and I cut a slit in it and put a little pink rose above it. I made this giant vagina. This was my very first set. It was a great hit. So that was performed at that farm, and at the time I carried a sketchbook with me, and actually I didn't have a camera or anything, and I actually still have a sketchbook with all the drawings I'd done in location. And then sort of Ann Garrity, there was Ann Garrity and Tom Hill, they were the directors. They were hired at Portland State to start an American theater company. They participated in the strike against the war, and the theater department there got upset that they struck against school policy.
Excuse me, this was the student strike after the Kensington State got
And they were fired. So there was a whole theater community here, out of work, and they liked it here in Portland, so they didn't want to move away. And they rented a little storefront on Russell Street, which is now Whitmer. And they started doing little theater workshops there, and since I lived really close there, I became really quickly involved in becoming a set designer, and then over the years I designed, I think, probably about 22 stage sets out there. I also became really good friends with a theater designer, director type named Rick Young, who was this extremely creative, imaginative person. And, you know, sitting next to Darcel, I get this sort of hints of Rick Young. He was extremely imaginative and really dedicated to do original theater rather than, you know, getting a script and sort of basing a set on that, but just making really completely original shows. And that was, you know, extremely enticing and attractive. And after my sort of called rejection by the Portland art community, it gave me the opportunity also to do really major works and have a kind of captive audience in the process. And in the beginning, they were like big, huge paintings made with aniline dye, and then before long, I was doing like architectural three-dimensional sets. And it turned out to be one of the most creative periods in my life, and I learned a great deal from that. And that whole period of storefront has been a tremendous influence later on in my paintings. The storefront itself sort of lasted for 20 years and sadly turned sort of into its opposite, and it became kind of an internal fighting. There were different kind of factions in it, and ultimately there became lawyers involved in it, and it became really a rather conservative theater. And then, of course, the AIDS epidemic, you know, caused the ultimate sad demise of the storefront theater. But it was the whole 60s and what followed out of that has been of a tremendous influence on me personally as an artist, and also gradually I become an Oregonian rather than an Amsterdammer.
Michael, could you tell me the connection between the Willamette Bridge and Cebu?
Willamette Bridge and Cebu. Well, there were probably only about 40 people in Portland at the time. I mean, everybody knew each other. I mean, we're talking Rick Young, Joe Ura's, Walt. It was so things were very, very ingrown. But Cebu spun off of a now defunct station in Seattle called Crab, and there was a sort of background, but Crab sent David Calhoun in his VW Bug with a 10-watt transmitter in the back seat to Portland and said, "Here's $50, go start a radio station."
And he ended up on your front porch.
And he ended up sleeping on our back porch because our previous next-door neighbor knew him. So the Willamette Bridge and Cebu sort of started at the same time. It was an overlapping cast. John Wilkinson, who did the article on the Willamette Bridge
About gay rights.
Came in through Cebu from previously being in Crab, which was where he was called Straight John. And so the first issue of the Willamette Bridge had a copy of the telegram from the FCC giving Cebu permission to go on the air. Real brief commercial here. Cebu is still around. Cebu is in the midst of turmoil. And thank you. I hope you're members because I'm running for the board of directors. As is Joe Uris, who wrote the introduction to this book. So vote early and often. But Cebu was this little funny radio station in a closet, probably about a third the size of this stage. You could have two people in it and a tape recorder, and that was about it.
Did he have his harpsichord or his David's piano?
David Calhoun, who who started, who was the first station manager out here, was a professional keyboardist, harpsichord and organ. And Meg Irwin, great harpsichordist. She actually had a little pipe organ in her house that we carried in from the pickup truck. She put together this thing. She was a great organist. Could not make a living in Portland and had to go teach at Oberlin or someplace. But yeah, there's another tie-in of David. I was driving around with David and I forget who else. Russell Kane, I think, was our first photographer at the bridge. We were driving down towards the Canby Ferry and we stopped and got a 6-pack of beer. That was before the days of Pop Tops. And we got back in the car and said, David, do you have a church key? Which is a beer can opener. And he said, yeah, in the glove compartment. And so I looked in the glove compartment and there wasn't anything. And I said, David, do you have a church key? And he reached over, he pulled out this ring of keys and he said, this is the key to St. Mark's, this is the key to St. Michael's, He had the keys to all of these churches because if you're an organist, that's where you can practice. And he would trade all these churches for tuning up their organs. And that, there were all these, we think of sort of hippies and stereotypes, but there are all these characters. And so the other thing, KBOO started at the same time as the Willamette Bridge and the same time as Outside In, which also, by the way, was in a little Victorian house that the Unitarians also donated. And KBOO and Outside In are still around and somewhat thriving. And we're now, 5 or 6 newspapers down the road.
Darcel, can you talk about some of the performances at the Cafe Espresso, like a bit more detail about the jazz performances downstairs?
Well, the only, let's see, Patti Smith played piano, didn't know how to play piano, but could knock the socks off you with jazz. She didn't know a note from one note from another, and her husband played bass.
Her husband was Carl Smith.
It's Carl Smith.
Uh-huh.
Oh, did you know him?
Well, I met him.
Oh, yeah, I see, you read the book. But most of the people that played, one evening, a man drove up in a beat-up old station wagon, and he brought his one-man band in, and it was the most exciting evening we'd had in a long time. He had a mouth harp, he had a fin here, and a thing there, and something there, and a washboard, and it was a great night. So, we didn't have names. We had names that would come in after hours at jazz, but they were just people having a great time. They never came up and said, I'm Carol Jader, and I'm this, that kind of thing. A xylophone, I don't know if you, but we didn't have names then. We've had names since at ourselves in the 60s. Maxine Andrews came and sang with us, and Christine Jorgensen, the first transgender went to Switzerland. And came back. She was George, and then she came back Christine. And so we had, the Laugh-In people came in and performed one time, and let's see, I don't know. It just, our doors will open. But it's more fun now because we all just get up there and scream and carry on and have a great time.
Peter, how did you end up leading the Portland Zoo?
Well, the Portland Zoo's history, as I understand it, because I only was there for a part of it, I missed the very beginning. And the very beginning, as I understand it, Tom McFarland great guitarist. And was tired of jamming with people. He wanted a band that would back him up so he could play blues in all 12 keys. So he went out and found some people and basically taught them to play. Although some of them had played some before. He found Charles Patton, who had played like folk guitar before, and taught her how to play rhythm guitar for a blues in any key. Found Lynn Parkinson and taught him how to play blues bass lines. As I understand it, he walked into the Lewis and Clark coffee shop and looked across the room and saw Larry Whitney there and said, "Ah, there's my drummer." And went over to Larry and said, "Do you play drums?" And Larry said, "No, would you like to?" "Yeah, sure." And bit by bit put together a band whose, as I understand it, the rehearsals consisted of playing a blues in A, and then playing a blues in D, and then playing a blues in G, and then playing blues in C, and then playing blues in F, then blues in B flat, then in E flat, then in A flat. Basically, all 12 keys, and then when they'd done that, they were done. That was and this was great because everybody was having a good time playing this blues, and he was he could pretty much carry it. And then one day he walked off and was gone. And the band was without a head.
Did he leave his guitar on the side of the road or something?
Well, as I understand it, he left his clothes and his guitar by the side of the road. It was a lovely guitar. I would love to have had it. And took off. He was upset over something. And I had known Charles at Reed as a student. And so Charles called me up and said, "We have a band, would you like to audition for it?" And I said, "A band?" "Yeah, a rock and roll band." "Oh, we mostly play blues." "Well, that would be fun, sure. You know, what's the job?" "Oh, leader." And I said, "Sure." And so I auditioned and became the leader of this band. And it was a wonderful band because they would do anything I asked them to. They had been trained to go along, and it was great because we got to be as experimental as we wished, and we were very lucky to have sort of blundered into being a house band at a coffee house that allowed us to play very often, gave us a chance to try things out. So I think that's how I became the leader of the band. I just I applied for the job.
Hank, can you talk about the red parties, please? Start up your red parties.
Yeah. Well, the old storefront was a little funky old storefront, but rent had to be paid. It was only $50 a month. And right now, Widmer Beer Company is here now. Then there was this old sort of brick building. The upstairs were abandoned apartments. They were like completely, totally abandoned. And there was like an old man living there in these apartments, a homeless man. And he made that his home. His name was Jojo. And occasionally, the toilet, there was no running water in these apartments up there. So the toilets, gradually Jojo had filled them all up. And occasionally, Jojo had to go for a leak and piss on the floor, and we were there rehearsing downstairs, and go drip, 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 and then Peter Gary would freak out and run up the stairs and, "God damn, Jojo, go piss outside." And so we had this sort of rather, rustic setting there. Then there were, a number of really very accomplished theater people, like John Morrison and Rick Young and Peter Garrett, excellent actors. And then there was a very large community of alternative folks and friends and they really started playing like, little, parts and roles. And Tom would, read like a little story by Thurber, and then he would divide up the little parts and he'd do little readings of them. Or There'd be other little playlets, and then people would come in and they'd pay $1, and then that would ultimately raise the rent. But they turned, and there would be musicians there, and after a period of time, these rent parties became like really cool parties. And there was more, as people became more versatile in the theater, and I must say that Tom Hill, who just died a couple of years ago, was just a superb theater teacher, and he had a sort of manner about him that he could really talk to people who had never been on the stage before and sort of give them kind of a sense of what it was like to be a performer, not by acting, but in a sense by saying from, you know, you cross this line here, and then across that line you are the king of Spain. I mean, everybody has agreed on that because that's your part. So all you really have to be is to be yourself. Just be completely yourself, and then you are naturally the king of Spain. That very simple directive gave people a kind of profound insight about how they could, you know, be on stage, and that was also like really superb performance and all that. So gradually they became more ambitious and stuff, and so then I think they did The Tavern by George M. Cohen, and assigned me that I was going to play a little part in that. And I had never been on the stage before, I'd never been in a theater before. I was really terrified to speak in public. And the explanation of the whole play came at the very end. That's, you know, this guy came in, the sheriff, or whatever, pounded on the door, and then screamed, and, you know, who are all you people, and where's the landlord? And then somebody would say something, and then I froze. And I stood there for like half a minute, and people say, and what did he say? And tried to feed me lines, and finally, it came back to me. So it was an incredibly intense sort of learning experience, but also a kind of open up a tremendous world. And I think I did that for a lot of people who became, you know, not only very turned on to the theater, but also very competent in it. And then after a while, the core of the theater, like at least Tom and Ann, decided that I wanted to, you know, move on and go back to the East Coast and stuff. And so people quickly took over in about 1975, and that became just a very, very successful, immensely popular theater for like a long period of time.
Michael, why do you think the underground press mushroomed across the country in the 60s?
Well, there were different things. I mean, of course, there was the counterculture and the outgrowth of the civil rights movement. There was the music. You know, one of the things, my particular theory of rock and roll, if you listen to music from the 50s, it's blum, 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 blum. And then there was the folk music era, when all these people learned to play guitar. And then when rock and roll came back, suddenly the music is complex. So there was all of that counterculture stuff going on that needed a voice, and that's what I was talking about in terms of building the community. The other thing was photo offset printing. That before the mid-60s, if you wanted to do a newspaper, you needed to have somebody sitting and setting type and linotype and all these things when they would set the type in hot lead and put them on the printing presses, and so it was very expensive. There was the Village Voice, and there was the Los Angeles Free Press, and those were big enough cities to afford it, but nobody else could afford an underground paper. And then somebody came up with the technology that you could take a sheet of aluminum and coat it with photosensitive stuff and take a picture and put it on that sheet of aluminum and develop it and put it on a printing press, and you could print whatever you had. So it made it possible. We put together our typesetting of the Willamette Bridge was a IBM Selectric typewriter, and you would just type this stuff up, and then we'd have a frying pan with wax in it. You take the wax and put it on the back of the paper and put it down. And they never let me near layout because I can't do a straight line. But you could print up. We would drive out to the Gresham Outlook, which had a little press, and we could print 1,000 copies for, I don't know, $75 or something, and come back downtown, and kids would go out and sell them on the street for 15 cents or a quarter, and then they would come back and pay us for the paper, or else they wouldn't come back and pay us for the paper. But it was enough to sort of keep going, and so there was the other thing was that as the whole counterculture, anti-war, gay rights, environmental stuff, all of that was going on, we were where you could find out about it. So these kids would go out and sell papers. At first they were selling like in the psychedelic supermarket and a few papers to hippies, but pretty soon all the parents whose kids were growing long hair and looking glassy-eyed wanted to know what was going on, so the parents would buy the newspaper. So you had these, kids downtown selling, and all these straight businessmen coming by and buying the paper to say, what the hell is Johnny doing? And so it grew to the point where I think by 1970 we were the third largest circulation paper in Oregon. And then, because there was sort of the success of people coming in, putting quarters into the wooden box and taking newspapers out, we never really thought about running a business, things like selling advertising, balancing books, and so forth. And so when people as time went by, people stopped buying the newspaper and the business model sort of imploded. But by that time, I was gone. So I was there during the glory days, and then I was living in New Hampshire.
Yeah, but then you came back and started another paper.
Then came back, and against all of our better judgment, the Willamette Bridge had folded. We came back to Portland, so we had been involved with the Willamette Bridge, and this is, if you think about 1970, the anti-war movement, all of this stuff, there were interminable meetings, and it was like the newspaper was taking over our lives. And it was stay with the newspaper or stay married. And so we took off to rural New Hampshire and then to Massachusetts, and the idea was we'd move back to Cambridge where there was real culture, unlike Portland, but we couldn't afford Cambridge, so we ended up in Maynard, Mass, which is a little working class town about 30 miles out, isolated from everything. And when we lived there, my twins were born, and then we decided we had more culture in Portland, so we moved back to Portland, and it's
Started the Scribe
more
at the
detail.
Centenary
More
Building.
detail. Started the Scribe actually in a house on about 32nd and Belmont, and my twin daughters who were here sort of grew up there. Their young age. There's pictures of them at like a year and a half old, digging into the waxer and so forth. And then you're right, the paper moved into the Centenary Wilbur. Another great thing of the era, Harper Richardson and the Centenary Wilbur Church.
So the waxer was no longer a frying pan?
I think by then we could afford an actual waxer, which was probably cost $18.
I would like to ask all of you what you remember about Lair Hill Park. Lair Hill Park. If you remember being in Lair Hill Park. You do, tell me.
I remember Park Commissioner Ivansy park commissioner, I obviously decided that the hippies were getting kind of out of line in Lair Hill Park and there ought to be a curfew. And I forget, the curfew was something really early. And so we decided that we really ought to celebrate his interest in us and held a party for him that started half an hour before the curfew in Lair Hill Park and invited all the media. And he did indeed come, and we managed to sail through the curfew with him smiling for the media. It was one of very few victories on our side with Lair Hill Park. Lair Hill Park had some wonderful concerts. Some of the pictures of the zoo that I treasure are from those days there. And actually, I've seen it recently when you had a bee in there, and I got to see it's still there. Still beautiful, but there weren't very many people.
Thank you. Lived right in that neighborhood.
I lived briefly right on Lair Hill Park, so I remember it really quite well. And there was a lot of conflict, and there was lots of people in the park, but there was also hecklers. And actually, I remember somebody driving by and sticking a revolver out of the car and sort of aiming it at all the gathered hippies. So there was an enormous amount of tension in that period, far more than there is now, for instance. There was a lot of sort of internal conflict in society itself, and that reflected itself very much also in Lair Hill Park. The curfew upset me in a sense, because from what I remember, and I'm sure there are totally inappropriate comparisons, but during the war, Jews were not allowed in public parks, and there were little signs on the trees that says "Verboten for Joden," forbidden for Jews, and that's what I recalled about these parks and this country being involved in a war and how it expressed itself and all this sort of subtle ways which sort of recalled some of that out of my childhood, and it upset me and angered me in a sense. And although I had not been, I was essentially apolitical when I came here, and my whole life had been really about making art and painting. I'd been sort of put with my nose on what happens to society and how it affects actual real people living in it. And so also that was kind of a kind of cultural shock, and at the same time a tremendous learning experience, and that sort of affected my point of view actually ever since.
Well, I think with that we should get some. We only have time for a couple of questions, so what I'm going to try to do is answer as many questions as I can on my Facebook page, which is called Portland in the 1960s. I'll be posting the answers to these things. Now, I'm looking for something that was handwriting I can read. Here's one. Are there any recordings from the early days of cable? Does anybody know the answer to that?
Any recordings from the early days of Cebu? Interestingly enough, there's a guy who's sort of quasi-staff at Cebu who discovered or started paying attention to all of these old reel-to-reel tapes, and there is an attempt to create a archive project. We were working on trying to digitize them. Didn't get funding, and I'm not sure exactly what's happening, but there are some recordings. One of the things about the old reel-to-reel tapes is that they were reusable. So there could be, wonderful interview that got covered up with, something else. that's doing Bruce Silverman is doing it. I don't know if Reinhardt's still around.
Yes, he is. Sure he is.
Okay.
Yeah, he lives in he's all over this book.
Okay.
For your information.
See what I know.
Here's another question. How does the spirit of Oregon's counterculture resonate today? Hank.
Well, I live here in the Hawthorne district, so I'm well aware of the incredible. There was always kind of it seems like a segment of young people who are somehow looking at alternative ways to live, or are have a rebellion, or there's also an enormous amount of technological change, of course, which at the time we were young in a sense. There was no internet, there was no iPhones, there was none of the kind of social media that existed. It was more, in a sense, it was more intimate in a way than I think it is now. I think also the AIDS epidemic has put kind of a damper on things and made people more cautious in a way. And at the same time, also, there's like an enormous amount of political tension, it seems, in this country, but I don't really see it really express itself in like huge demonstrations and stuff. But maybe I'm not as aware of it because I spend nowadays most of my time in my studio.
And just one more question. Oh,
I think there is a tremendous sort of the equivalent of the counterculture now that all over the East Side there are young people doing creative things. I think that one of the things is that life was so easy, and it's not now. I mean, we could, at the Willamette Bridge, we paid people $35 a week, and they could live on it. And, 3 or 4 people get a house, and they paid $50 a month for it. And that's no longer true. So there's a certain amount, and I knew that I could hitchhike to any city in the country, get a minimum wage job in a week, and rent an apartment for minimum wage. And there's a tremendous freedom that I think kids don't have now.
Peter or Marcel, did you want to answer that question?
Sorry?
Did you want to answer that question also?
Oh, well, I don't know. It seems like what I sort of associate with Portland more than Oregon per se, because I have friends, black musicians who, when coming to Portland, said Portland's great, but I wouldn't go to Eastern Oregon. I'd much rather go to Mississippi. So there's it's not really unified, and I wonder if the Portlandia that we have now is kind of just the natural outgrowth of the sort of the Portland sensibilities that were there in the 60s. I think the harder times economically have a big impact on that. As a representative of the relatively well-off Reed student coming to Portland, where I could afford to spend a week standing in line protesting something because I didn't have to work constantly, and it's not as easy now. So I think the ebb and flow is in the ebb.
Did you want to answer? Well, thank you very much, everybody. That's all we have.
music.
Thank you. Once again, another round of applause. So, now it's time for music. Next up is Portland Zoo. It's going to take just a few minutes to clear the tables and get the musicians up here. In the meanwhile, out in the lobby, if you haven't seen it, there's a table full of Paulina's books and DVDs about Hank Pender, a great DVD that's available for sale. Darcel has got books and probably will be signing out there if you'd like. So really just a few minutes. Please take a break and come on back, and we'll see you real soon. Thank you.